The desert sun burned like fire over the endless dunes. Heat waves rose from the sand and shimmered like ghosts, hiding what moved beneath. The wind carried a low growl, a sound that made the rocks themselves tremble. People whispered that the sound was the hunger of the sandworms. They were beasts so ancient that even the oldest tribes feared to speak their true names. And today, one of them had been promised a feast. Against a wall of sun-baked stone, the alien girl hung in chains. Her skin was blue as deep water, her silver hair tangled in the hot wind. She had been given to the worm as a sacrifice. Her tribe had no other choice, they said. Her life for their lives. She closed her eyes as the sand began to shake, and the deep rumble grew louder. Fear pressed her chest like stone. She had heard the stories of how the worms fed, and she knew the end would not be merciful. But the desert had other plans. From the far horizon, a figure stepped out of the dust. The storm of sand behind him glowed in the sunlight, turning his shadow into a black flame across the dunes. His body was scarred, his muscles hard from years of war. Across his back hung weapons that no tribe here had seen before. He was human. The girl's eyes widened, for she had heard of this kind only in forbidden tales. They were said to be wanderers, destroyers, survivors who never bowed to monsters. And now one walked into her doom as if he had been summoned by the desert itself. The worm burst from the ground with a roar that split the sky. Its body was a mountain of scales and teeth, a tunnel of death that rose higher than the stone walls. Its mouth opened, a black ring filled with daggers, each tooth long enough to crush a warrior whole. Sand fell from its body like waterfalls, and the earth trembled as it lunged toward the chained girl. The tribe had already fled. Only the girl remained to scream her final breath. Only the human remained to face what no one dared. He did not scream. He did not run. His hand touched the weapon at his side, a curved blade forged in fire unlike any on this world. His other hand carried a rifle, heavy and humming with strange power. He planted his feet in the sand, looked up at the beast, and did not blink. For a heartbeat, the desert itself seemed to hold its breath. The worm's shadow swallowed him, but his gaze never left its mouth. He stood alone, but his stance told the girl he had fought worse. He had walked through dust and fire for battles beyond her dreams, and now he had come here for this. The chains rattled as the girl tried to move. She shouted for him to run, her voice cracking in the heat. No human could fight such a thing. Not even the strongest of her warriors had ever dared. Yet the man only tilted his head, as if listening to her words carried by the storm. Then he raised his blade, its steel catching the sunlight, a line of fire against the golden sky. And with a calm voice, so steady it cut through the beasts. "Roar," he spoke. She could not hear the words clearly, but she knew their meaning. He was not here to die. He was here to kill. The worm lunged, the earth shook. The girl shut her eyes against the blinding spray of sand. The sound of steel meeting. Scale rang across the desert like thunder. When she opened her eyes, she saw the impossible. The human was still standing, his blade buried deep in the worm's flesh. His body braced like a wall of iron. Blood black as oil spilled across the sand. The worm howled in pain, its scream echoing for miles, shaking stones from their cliffs. But the human did not step back. His battle had only begun. The desert shook as the wounded worm twisted its giant body. Sand rose like waves, falling in storms that blinded the sky. Its roar was so loud that the mountains in the distance trembled. The alien girl pressed her back against the stone, her chains rattling with every crash of the beast. She thought she had seen her final moment, but instead she saw the human stand strong in the storm. His blade dripped with black blood that burned holes in the sand. His eyes never left the monster that towered before him. The worm slammed its body into the ground, sending a wall of sand rolling across the desert. The human raised his arm to shield his face, but his feet never moved. When the dust cleared, his rifle was in his hands. With a calm movement, he pulled the trigger. The weapon roared with fire and thunder. Blue-white bolts of energy slammed into the worm's open mouth, striking the soft flesh inside. The beast screamed, thrashing in pain. The ground cracked under its weight as it twisted away. But the human kept firing, every shot finding its mark like he had done this 1,000 times before. The girl could not believe what she saw. Her tribe had offered her as a sacrifice because no warrior could face such a creature. They had said it was hopeless to resist. Yet here stood this man, wrapped in dust and blood, fighting as though fear was not a word he knew. She shouted again, her voice breaking, calling for him to stop before he was crushed. But her words seemed to vanish in the roar of battle. His answer was not spoken. It was in the way he moved, steady and relentless. He would not stop until the desert was quiet. The worm lunged again, its jaws wide enough to swallow the human. Ho! He dropped the rifle and rolled across the sand, the teeth closing just behind him. The ground split open where the jaws slammed shut, sending rocks flying into the air. The man rose to his feet in a smooth motion, pulling a second blade from his back. It was shorter than the first, but its edge glowed faintly, carved with strange marks. He dashed forward, sliding under the shadow of the worm's body, and slashed deep into its underside. Blood sprayed like rain, burning into the sand with smoke. The worm twisted in fury, but the human was already gone from its reach. The girl pulled at her chains until her wrists bled. She could not stand and watch. Her heart pounded with a strange mix of fear and hope. For the first time she wondered if the sacrifice had been a lie. Perhaps the desert had sent this man. Perhaps the legends of humans were true. She cried out his name, though she did not know it, only to give her voice to the storm. He turned his head for a moment, their eyes meeting across the chaos. In that look she saw no fear, only fire, only war. The worm rose higher, blocking the sun, its body curling like a mountain ready to fall. The shadow swallowed the battlefield. The man planted his feet once more, lifting both blades. His voice carried across the wind, low but strong. The girl did not understand the words, yet she felt their meaning in her bones. He spoke like a warrior who had no chains, no master, no fate but his own. His words promised only one end. The beast would die here. The desert would not claim him. Not today. The worm struck like a storm, its body crashing down with the force of an earthquake. Dust exploded into the air, hiding everything in blinding light. The girl gasped, unable to see through the storm. Her heart froze as silence followed. The crash, but then the dust cleared, and she saw him again. The human stood atop the worm's body, his blade buried deep into the crown of its head. The monster's mouth opened wide in a final scream, but no sound came. Its massive body began to collapse into the sand. The desert shivered with the death of its oldest predator. The man pulled his blade free and leapt to the ground as the worm fell lifeless. The desert was silent after the fall of the worm. Its giant body lay half buried in the sand, a mountain of dead flesh steaming under the burning sun. The ground was soaked with its black blood, and the air smelled of metal and smoke. The alien girl leaned against the stone wall, her chest rising and falling fast. Her wrists burned from the chains, but she no longer cared. She could only stare at the human who had done the impossible. He stood with his back straight, his blades dripping with the dark liquid of the beast. The sun cut across his shoulders, marking every scar as a line of war. He breathed slowly, as though this battle had been nothing more than another step in a long path. Then he turned toward the girl. His eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw something beyond fire. There was no pride in his face, only focus, only the will of a man who knew battles never truly ended. The girl called out, her voice breaking as she begged him to free her. The chains rattled with her desperate movement. He walked toward her, his boots heavy against the sand. Each step carried weight, not only of his body but of his purpose. When he reached the wall, he placed his hand on the iron links. With one sharp strike of his blade, the chain snapped like a twig. The girl fell forward into his arms, her knees weak from exhaustion. He steadied her without a word, and in that silence she felt safer than she had in her whole life. She tried to speak, to thank him, to ask who he was, but her words tangled in her throat. He only raised his hand and pointed to the horizon. The storm was coming again. Not of wind or sand, but of more worms. The battle had not gone unheard. The desert always answered blood with hunger. She heard it too, the low rumble far in the distance. The ground beneath her bare feet quivered. Fear returned to her chest, sharper than the chains had ever been. But the man's face did not change. His eyes narrowed, ready for more. Together they moved away from the stone wall. The girl stumbled, but the human slowed his steps so she could keep up. His movements were careful, yet always aware of the land around them. Every dune, every shadow was measured by his gaze. She realized then that he was not lost here. He knew how to walk this desert better than anyone she had ever seen. The sand that was death to her people seemed to obey his feet. It was as if the world itself gave him passage. The rumble grew louder. From behind a dune, 3 smaller worms broke the surface, each half the size of the great beast, but still larger than any creature she had ever seen. Their bodies slithered through the sand, circling like sharks in water. Their mouths opened, dripping with hunger. The girl clutched her chest, unable to breathe. But the human simply set her down gently on the sand. He pulled his rifle from his back and aimed without hesitation. The first shot tore through the head of one worm, sending it crashing into the ground. The second shot forced the others to scatter, roaring in pain and fury. The girl had never seen such precision. Every move he made was sharp and perfect, as if guided by something beyond training. His arms moved like iron, his eyes like cold fire. He fired again, and another worm fell, its body thrashing as it sank into the sand. The last one lunged forward, trying to take him by surprise. But he turned, faster than the wind itself, and his blade was already in his hand. He leapt forward, striking deep into its throat. The beast crashed down beside him, black blood splashing across his chest. He wiped it away with one slow motion, his eyes still scanning the horizon. The desert grew quiet once again. Only the sound of the wind moved across the dunes. The girl crawled closer, her heart still racing. She wanted to ask him why he had come. She wanted to know why a human would risk his life for someone he did not know. But before she could speak, he looked at her, his voice finally breaking the silence. It was low, calm, and certain. He said she was not safe yet. The desert had more to give, and this was only the beginning. Asterisk, the sun dipped lower in the desert sky, painting the dunes with fire and shadow. The air was heavy with the stench of blood from the slain worms. The girl's breath shook as she stood beside the human. Her body trembled, but it stood calm and unbroken. He looked across the horizon as though expecting more, as though danger was never truly gone. The silence between them was filled with questions she dared not ask. He turned to her at last. His voice was steady, carrying no doubt. He asked if she could walk. She nodded, though her legs still felt weak. He motioned for her to follow, and together they began their slow journey across the sand. Every step was hard, but his presence gave her strength. The chains were gone from her wrists, yet she felt a different weight pressing inside her heart. She had been given to die, but now she lived, and only because of him. As they moved, the girl spoke in fragments. She told him of her tribe, of their fear, of the bargain made with the desert. The worms demanded sacrifices, and the tribe obeyed. To resist meant death for all. She was chosen because she was young, because her life could buy another year of safety. Her words fell like stones, but the human's face did not change. He listened, silent and unshaken, as though he had heard such stories in many lands. When she finished, he only said that no bargain with monsters was ever true. They climbed a high dune and paused to rest. From the crest, the girl could see the broken body of the great worm far behind, its carcass half buried in the shifting sands. For the first time in her life, she saw proof that the beasts were not eternal. Something inside her shifted, a spark of hope that had never been lit before. She looked at the human with wide eyes, and she whispered that he had changed everything. He shook his head and said it was only the beginning. The ground shook again. From the far distance, a storm of sand rose, higher than the mountains. The girl's heart froze. More worms were coming, drawn by the scent of blood and the sound of death. She clutched her arms tight, but the human lifted his rifle, scanning the horizon. He did not look afraid. Instead, he looked ready, as though this was the battle he had expected from the start. The girl realized then that his steps into this desert were no accident. He had come here for war. They moved down the dune and found shelter in the shadow of a rocky cliff. The stone walls cut the wind, but they did little to silence the growing thunder of the worms. The girl leaned against the rock, her body weak from fear and hunger. The human searched through his pack, pulling out a flask. He handed it to her, and the water inside was cool, unlike any she had ever tasted. She drank with shaking hands, and when she gave it back, he simply nodded. For a moment, she felt alive again. The rumble grew louder, and soon the ground beneath them quivered like a drum. The girl gasped as the sand split open, not far away. 3 more worms erupted from the desert, larger than the ones before, their bodies twisting and circling with rage. Their eyes glowed faintly in the fading light, and their mouths opened wide, ready to tear everything apart. The human rose to his feet, blades in hand, his shadow stretching long against the cliff. He turned to the girl only once, his voice quiet but sharp. He told her to stay behind him. The battle began with a roar that shattered the quiet. The first worm lunged forward, and the human met it head-on. His rifle thundered, his blade cut, and sparks of black blood lit the air like fire. The other worms circled, their bodies shaking the sand with each strike. The girl pressed her back against the rock, her eyes wide, watching a storm of dust and steel unfold before her. The man was only one, but he fought like an army. His movements were sharp, his will unbroken, and the desert itself seemed to echo his fury. The clash shook the desert like thunder rolling through stone. The human moved with speed that seemed impossible in the heavy sand. His rifle cracked with light, tearing into the hide of one worm. The creature's body twisted as black blood sprayed across the dunes. But the others came fast, their massive jaws snapping shut where he had stood only a moment before. He rolled aside, his blades flashing in the dim light of the sinking sun. Each strike was clean, sharp, and meant to kill. The girl held her breath. As the battle unfolded, she could not look away even though terror burned her chest. Every movement of the human felt like defiance against the laws of the desert. Her people had accepted the worms as death itself, yet he fought them as though they were nothing but beasts of flesh and blood. She wanted to scream, to cheer, to beg him to survive, but her voice stayed locked behind her teeth. She could only press her hands against her heart and pray, silently to a sky that had never listened before. The first worm crashed into the cliff, shaking loose stones that fell around them. The human leapt high, landing on the creature's back. His blade pierced deep into its scales, carving a wound that bled black rivers into the sand. The beast thrashed violently, but he held firm, driving the steel deeper until its body twisted and sank. With a final roar, it fell limp, crashing into the desert floor. He pulled his weapon free and turned before the second worm struck. His Face showed no fear, only fire. The second came with open jaws wide enough to crush him whole. He dropped low, sliding beneath its mouth as its teeth clamped down on empty sand. With perfect aim, he fired his rifle into its throat. The sound echoed like thunder inside the beast. It convulsed, its long body curling as smoke poured from the wound. With another shot, its head burst open, spraying blood and fire across the ground. The girl shielded her eyes from the horror, but when she looked again, she saw the man still standing tall, the last worm circled with caution now. Its glowing eyes locked on the human, and its body shifted beneath the sand. It moved faster than the others, vanishing beneath the surface only to reappear behind him. The girl screamed a warning, her voice breaking the silence of the storm. He spun, raising both blades just in time. The jaws snapped shut around him, but he forced the steel between them, holding the mouth open with sheer strength. The beast roared, its breath hot enough to burn his skin, but his arms did not give way. With a final cry, he drove his weapon upward, splitting its head until the monster fell dead at his feet. The desert fell quiet once again. 3 worms lay dead, their bodies stretched across the dunes like fallen mountains. The girl sank to her knees, tears running down her face. She had never believed such a thing could be done. Her whole life had been chained by fear, but now the chains were broken. She lifted her gaze to the man, who stood among the corpses like a figure carved from stone. His chest rose and fell slowly, his blades dark with blood. He turned to her, and she felt her breath catch in her throat. He walked to her side and helped her rise. His grip was steady, neither gentle nor harsh, but firm enough to remind her that he was made for survival. She whispered a question that had burned inside her since the first moment he appeared. Why had he saved her? His eyes met hers, and his answer was as simple as it was final. He said no one should be food for worms. His voice carried no pride, no kindness, only truth. And that truth shook her more than any battle. The girl realized then that this man was not just a warrior. He was something more. He was proof that the desert was not a god, and the worms were not eternal. She felt something awaken inside her, something she had never dared believe. It was hope, fierce and alive, blazing like the fire in his eyes. And for the first time, she no longer feared the horizon. She wanted to follow it. She wanted to follow him. Night began to fall over the desert. The sky turned deep red, then darkened into violet as the first stars appeared. The sand cooled beneath their feet, though the air still carried the weight of blood and battle. The girl walked close to the human, her steps unsteady but stronger than before. She kept looking back at the corpses of the worms half buried in the sand like broken hills. Her people would never believe what she had seen. Even she struggled to believe it, though she had lived it with her own eyes. The human led them deeper into the desert. He moved with purpose, as though he knew where safety lay. His weapons were sheathed across his back, but his hand never strayed far from them. He walked like a man who expected danger with every step. The girl wanted to ask him his name, but her voice hesitated. She feared that if she spoke too much, the silence between them would break, and with it the strange bond that had already begun to form. Finally, she whispered her question. He answered with a single word, a name heavy with iron. That was all he gave and all she needed. They reached another cliff as the stars thickened above. Here the human stopped and searched the rock for shelter. At last he found a hollow carved into the stone, large enough for both to rest. He motioned for her to go inside. She obeyed, sitting down on the cool ground. He gathered dry wood, striking sparks with metal until a fire burned. The light painted his face in gold and shadow. The girl watched quietly, trying to understand how one man could hold so much strength, how one man could change the desert itself with his will. As the fire burned, the girl spoke again. She told him more about her people. They lived in fear of the worms. They built their homes close to stone walls, hoping the beasts would not dig through. Every year they offered a life, believing that sacrifice would keep the rest safe. But the worms always returned, hungrier each time. She asked him if fighting them would only bring more. His eyes reflected the flames as he answered. He said monsters only grew bold when no one stood against them. His voice was calm, but his words carried the weight of war. The girl listened, her hands gripping her knees. For the first time, she wondered if her people had been wrong for generations. They had given everything to fear, and fear had given nothing back. She thought of her father, her brothers, her friends still alive in the village. She realized that as long as they bowed, the worms would never stop. Tears filled her eyes, but she wiped them quickly. She asked him if he would help her tribe. He did not answer at once. He looked into the fire, then at the stars. At last he said he had not come to save tribes. He had come to end the worms. The fire burned low, and the desert wind howled against the stone. The girl shivered, pulling her arms around herself. The human took off his cloak and placed it over her shoulders. The cloth was rough, smelling of smoke and dust, but its weight brought comfort. She looked at him in silence, her lips trembling with unspoken words. Gratitude filled her chest, but so did something else, something deeper and harder to name. He sat across from her, sharpening his blade with calm strokes. Every scrape of metal on stone rang like a promise of battles yet to come. When sleep finally came, the girl dreamed of fire and sand. She dreamed of her people standing tall without chains. She dreamed of the worms falling one by one before the human's blade. She woke to the sound of the desert, to the hiss of shifting sand outside their shelter. The fire was low, but the man was already awake, standing at the entrance, watching the horizon. His figure was a dark shadow against the dawn light. She rose slowly, her heart pounding as she joined him. He pointed toward the far dunes. In the distance, more shapes moved beneath the sand, rising and falling like waves. The girl gasped, clutching the cloak tighter around her. There were many, far more than before. She could see their massive bodies breaking the surface, sending fountains of sand into the air. It was not a hunt. It was a gathering. The human's jaw tightened, but his eyes burned brighter. He turned to her, his voice steady and final. He said the true war was only beginning. The morning sun rose over the dunes, turning the desert into a sea of gold. The girl stood beside the human, her body tense as she watched the distant shapes. Dozens of worms moved through the sand, their shadows stretching wide across the horizon. The desert was alive with their hunger, and she felt the ground tremble beneath her bare feet. Her people had never faced more than one at a time. Now she saw what the desert truly held, and fear filled her chest once more. The human lowered his hand from pointing. His eyes narrowed as he studied the movement of the beasts. He seemed calm, though his jaw was set like iron. The girl waited for him to speak, her heart racing, but he only moved back into the shelter. He gathered his weapons with careful precision, checking each blade, each round of energy for his rifle. She realized then that he had expected this from the start. Every battle before had been nothing but the opening of a larger war. The girl followed him inside, clutching the cloak around her shoulders. Her voice shook as she asked how they could possibly fight so many. He looked at her for a long moment, his face unreadable in the dim light. Then he answered simply that he had faced armies before, and the desert was no different. His words struck her like stone. They carried no boast, no lie, only truth. He had come not to survive but to end what ruled here. And he meant every word. They left the shelter and climbed the dunes once more. The girl stumbled, her legs weak, but the man slowed his pace so she would not fall behind. He moved as though every step mattered, placing his boots with care, scanning the sky and sand around them. The wind grew harsher, carrying the faint cries of the worms as they called to one another. The girl shivered at the sound. It was a song of hunger, a song of death. She wished she could cover her ears, but the desert never let anyone hide. At the top of the dune, the human paused again. He looked down at the valley below, where the largest worm yet rose from the sand. Its body was massive, stretching higher than the cliffs themselves. Its skin was lined with scars from countless battles, its mouth a black ring of teeth that could swallow an entire house. Around it circled the smaller ones, dozens of them weaving through the sand. The girl's knees gave out at the sight. She dropped to the ground, whispering that it was impossible. But the man only drew his blade, his eyes hard with fire. Ground shook as the worms began to move toward them. The girl tried to rise, but her legs would not obey. The human stepped forward, standing tall against the rising storm. His voice carried back to her, low but steady. He told her to stay where she was, to live, to remember. She wanted to call out, to stop him, but her throat closed. All she could do was watch as he marched down into the valley alone, a single man against the fury of the desert. The worms roared as they charged, their bodies tearing through the dunes like rivers of flesh. The human raised his rifle, and fire exploded from its barrel. Each shot cut through the air like lightning, striking deep into their bodies. One by one they fell, but more kept coming, endless and furious. He switched to his blades, meeting them head-on, slashing, stabbing, cutting through scale and bone. His movements were a storm, faster than her eyes could follow. The valley became a battlefield of dust and blood, the sky black with the smoke of war. The girl pressed her hands together as tears ran down her face. She whispered to the sky, begging for his survival. She had once believed no one could stand against the worms, but now she saw a truth greater than fear. He was not fighting for himself alone. He was fighting for all who had ever been chained by this desert. His body moved with fury, but his spirit moved with something deeper. He fought with a purpose she could feel even from where she knelt. He fought so no one would ever be food for worms again. The valley shook with chaos. Dust clouds rose into the sky, and the sound of battle thundered across the desert. The girl knelt on the dune, her hands clutching the cloak around her shoulders. Her eyes followed the human's figure as he fought below. He moved like a force of nature, his blades flashing, his rifle roaring. Every worm that lunged toward him fell with blood pouring into the sand. But there were so many, too many for one man to face. Fear tore at her heart, yet hope burned stronger than it ever had before. The largest worm moved at last. Its body lifted from the sand like a mountain rising, and its roar split the air. The sound rattled her bones and filled the valley with dread. Even the smaller beasts paused at the command of their leader. The girl gasped as she saw the shadow of its jaws stretch across the human. The creature opened its mouth wide, a black pit of endless teeth. The man raised both blades and charged forward without hesitation. His roar rose to meet the monsters, and the desert shook as they collided. The clash was like thunder striking the earth. The girl cried out, unable to see through the storm of sand that exploded into the air. She pressed her face into her hands, but she forced herself to look again. The human had leapt onto the back of the giant beast, driving his blade deep into its scales. The worm screamed and twisted, thrashing to throw him off. But he clung on, climbing higher, cutting deeper, his movements fierce and relentless. She had never seen such will, and her heart pounded with every strike he made. The battle raged across the valley. Smaller worms tried to attack, but the man turned their strikes against the larger beast. He moved with purpose, always climbing toward the crown of its head. His rifle barked in bursts, searing holes into its flesh, but it was his blades that carved the final path. The girl screamed his name, though her voice was lost in the storm. Still, she kept shouting, giving him the strength of her faith. For the first time, she believed the desert could be broken. The great worm reared high into the sky, its body towering above the cliffs. The human reached the top of its head, his blades shining in the sun. With both hands he drove his weapon down, piercing the skull with all his strength. The roar that followed shook the earth, tearing the sky with sound. The girl fell to her knees as the giant writhed in death, its body crashing into the sand. With a force that sent waves across the valley, the other worms fled in panic, vanishing beneath the dunes. Silence fell, broken only by the sound of the wind. When the dust cleared, she saw him still standing. His body was covered in blood and dust, but his figure was unbroken. He pulled his blade free and walked slowly back across the fallen flesh. The girl ran toward him, her legs stumbling, her tears falling freely. She reached him and caught his arm, holding on as if she would never let go. For a moment, neither spoke. The world was silent but for the beating of their hearts. He looked down at her, his eyes calm, and she felt her breath catch. She whispered that he had saved not only her life but the life of her people. He shook his head and said he had only done what had to be done. His words carried no pride, no boast, only truth. She told him that he had ended the curse of the desert, that he had given them freedom. For the first time since the chains had bound her, she felt light. She knew then that hope was no longer a dream. It was real, standing before her, scarred but alive. The girl took his hand, and together they climbed the dune to look over the valley. The corpses of the worms lay silent, their reign of terror ended. The sun broke through the clouds, shining over the endless sand. The desert that had once been a prison now looked like open land. She turned to him, her voice soft but steady. She asked what came next. He looked to the horizon, his face unshaken, and answered that they would walk forward, for the desert belonged to no beast anymore.